I'm not used to sneezing like this. The second chapter. Sonic sniffled a few times, bringing his neck backward a bit with each breath, and then he brought his hand up to rub underneath his nose again. He watched as Tails conversed with the members of Team Chaotix, and sometimes they shared a laugh over something one of them had said. Sonic was glad they were having a good time, but he was also a bit saddened. He really wanted to keep hanging out with them, but he had a feeling it wouldn't be a good idea if he did. It had been an hour and a half since Sonic and Tails had arrived at the park, and about a third that time since Sonic had confessed to Espio, Vector, and Charmy that he'd come down with a case of tiny sneeze. Even though it wasn't as severe as other times where he'd gotten sick, it was still pretty embarrassing that he'd caught him sneezing so quietly. The only thing that would have been worse was if Dr. Eggman, Shadow, or just about any other one of his rivals were the one who'd seen him sneeze like that. Luckily, the Chaotix members understood his plight and offered him their sympathy. And after that, Tails had found him a good spot where he could relax. In this case, the bottom of a shady tree that wasn't too far away from where their friends had been, and left him there with his box of tissues that he'd brought from home. After all, the two-tailed fox did mention that precautions must be made to avoid infecting others, as Sonic had overheard him reading earlier that day before they'd left. Shoot! Sonic sneezed again, bringing his neck forward as he did, and then he rubbed his nose with his forefinger. A couple more sniffles slipped out, but they weren't much help. His nasal passages were just too stuffed up. In fact, the outside of his nose had turned a bright red, in contrast to the slightly less red shade it had become earlier this morning. Sonic's free hand reached over to his box of tissues and pulled one out. He held that same tissue to his nose and blew, but it didn't bring him as much relief as he would have liked. As he lost his breath, Sonic wiped his nose, holding his tissue in both hands. Just as he finished, he could see Tails walking over to him. Sonic managed a little smile as he balled up his used tissue and lowered it from his friend's view. "Hey, Sonic, how are you feeling?" Tails wanted to know. Another sniffle from Sonic. "That bad. I'm still kind of steezy, though. Shoot." At just the right moment, he turned his head away from Tails, firing another mild sneeze into his elbow. Then he turned back to look at his friend, rubbing his nose again with his forefinger as he did. "Bless you," said Tails. "Thanks," Sonic replied. "Should we head home now?" Tails suggested. "I'll stay by your side and keep you company if you want. It'll be like when you caught a cold a few months ago and I took care of you." "You know, that's a good idea," said Sonic. With that, he got up, picking up his box of tissues and putting them behind his back so he wouldn't lose them. He and Tails said their goodbyes to the members of Team Chaotix, with the latter hoping that Sonic would feel better soon. Sonic thanked them for their wishes and made his way out of the park, with Tails following not too far behind. As they were on their way to Sonic's house, the hedgehog couldn't help but sniffle a few more times, and sometimes he sneezed again. That being said, each one of the sneezes were barely audible, and yet Tails heard each one and made sure to bless him as Sonic rubbed his nose afterward. A few minutes later, however, they'd arrived at their destination, and Tails carefully opened the door for Sonic. Almost as soon as they were inside, Sonic was sitting on the couch, with his box of tissues brought out again and placed close to him, so he would be able to reach them when he needed to. "Hey, Tails," Sonic asked, "does that book say anything on how to treat tidy stees?" Let me see." Tails opened the medical book and flipped through the pages, trying to get back to the article on the aforementioned virus. As he did, however, a few small clouds of dust drifted into the air, and Sonic could feel it tickling his nose. His eyelids lowered as his nose twitched, and his breath began to hitch. He was going to sneeze again. He was sure of it. Shoot! Shoot! Achoo! Sonic brought his neck forwards as he sneezed 3 times, with his hand moving up to cover his mouth and nose just before the third sneeze. He then sniffled and rubbed his nose with his forefinger. Sorry. Bless you, Sonic. Tails apologized.
Sonic just sniffled, forefinger under nose. He wasn't proud of himself for sneezing into his hand. Tails had warned him at least twice that wasn't a good idea, because it would risk spreading germs or something, but sometimes he just couldn't help himself. As Sonic wiped his hand off, Tails read to him from the treatment section of the Tiny Sneeze article.
The best treatment for a case of tiny sneeze is more or less the same as that for the common cold. Getting plenty of rest, drinking lots of liquids, and keeping yourself warm and comfortable for the duration of the virus. If you desire temporary relief via medicine for your symptoms, taking some decongestants or antihistamines can help. Sonic was a bit expressionless over what the second sentence was referring to, but Tails clarified. They're talking about cold or allergy medicine. Oh, right. Sonic nodded now that he understood, but then another sneeze found its way out, catching him a bit off guard.
Hatch. The sneeze was followed by another light sneeze, although this one took a couple of seconds before it came forth. Achoo. The hedgehog then brought out another tissue from his box and wiped his red nose with it. I'm afraid you'll have to rest for a bit and let the virus run its course, Tails said. But don't worry. If there's anything you want from me, I'll keep you company and make sure you're as comfortable as possible. Sonic smiled. Thanks, Tails. That means a lot to me. Tails smiled in return, but then he heard a knock on the front door. He turned around and headed over to the door, and Sonic stayed on the couch, still sniffling and wiping his nose.
Knuckles?
Amy asked. She and Knuckles had been waiting at the front door for at least a few minutes.
I'm really worried about Sonic. I haven't seen him all day.
Yeah, I'm worried too, Knuckles replied. But it's not like Eggman captured him or anything, right? The door opened to reveal Tails, and he smiled as he recognized both of his friends.
Oh, hey guys.
Hey, Tails, Knuckles replied. What brings you here? Tails wanted to know. Amy and I haven't heard from Sonic in a while, so I thought maybe we'd come over and check up on him, Knuckles said.
Do you know where he is?
Amy asked. Yeah, he's in the living room, Tails said, and Amy breathed a sigh of relief. Though I should probably point out that he isn't feeling too well. Oh, really? What's wrong with him? Knuckles wanted to know, but before Tails could answer, the three of them heard a faint sneezing sound coming from the living room. Knuckles and Amy couldn't quite make out what it was, although Tails could. You might want to come in and see for yourself, said Tails. Sonic sulked as he rubbed his nose again with his forefinger. He'd lost track of how many times he'd sneezed today, but he wasn't enjoying it in the slightest. He brought out another tissue from his box and blew his nose again, but he couldn't get his nasal passages to clear up. As he wiped his nose afterward, he could see Knuckles coming into the living room along with Tails. Hey, Sonic, Knuckles greeted him. Hey, Knuckles, Sonic replied. He then noticed that Amy had come in here as well, so he greeted her as well. And hey, Amy.
Hi, Sonic. What's the matter? Do you have a cold? Amy asked in a concerned, sympathetic tone.
Sonic sniffled, a bit embarrassed, but he decided he didn't have a choice but to admit it to her. It's a little different, but yeah, pretty much, he replied, lowering his tissue from his face. Now that you mention it, your nose does look pretty red. Almost as red as me, Knuckles acknowledged. What's gotten into you, dude? Knuckles, Amy. Another sniffle from Sonic, and then he confessed the truth. I've cupped down with Tiny Sneeze. Knuckles and Amy's eyes were wide with slight disbelief, and they couldn't help but look at each other. Tiny Sneeze, huh? I never heard of that one, said Knuckles.
Yeah, me neither,
Amy agreed. Sonic had a feeling they wouldn't believe him, but then his nose began to twitch again. He lowered his eyelids and brought his tissue back up, preparing to sneeze into it. Achoo! The sneeze was a little drawn out, but it was still quiet and mild. But Knuckles wasn't prepared for how different it sounded compared to the louder sneezes he'd heard from Sonic before, and neither was Amy. They just stood where they were, not believing what they'd seen or heard. Then Amy smiled, and her eyes began to sparkle a bit in adoration. Sonic wiped his nose with his tissue, sniffling as he blushed a bit.
Oh, Sonic, that was so cute!
Amy cried, and Sonic kept blushing in response. From there, Tails explained for him. As it turns out, tiny sneeze is a variant of the common cold. It's not quite as bad as a cold, but it has a few of the same symptoms. And the virus that causes it is causing Sonic to sneeze much more quietly than usual. He'll feel better in a few days, but until then, it might take some getting used to. Looks like you could use a helping hand, Sonic, Knuckles said.
Yeah, Amy said in agreement. Why don't we stay and take care of you?
Well... Sonic lowered his tissue from his face and rubbed his nose with his forefinger. I guess I wouldn't bite if you guys helped me feel better. Amy gave him a reassuring smile and rubbed the top of his head gently with her hand.
Don't worry about a thing, Sonic-oo.
Sonic couldn't help but manage a little smile. A few minutes later, Tails had brought in a couple of blankets for Sonic, one of which was an electric blanket, and covered Sonic with them to help keep him warm. He then switched on the blanket with the flick of a switch, before he and Knuckles headed into the kitchen to make some tea for Sonic. As they did, Amy sat down on the couch next to the sniffling hedgehog to keep him company.
Hey, Sonic?
Amy asked, and Sonic moved his head up to look at her.
Tails and Knuckles are working on something to help you feel better, but for now I was thinking we could spend some time together.
I figured you'd want to. Achoo! Sonic let out 2 more sneezes, making sure to put his arm over his mouth each time he released, and then he rubbed his nose with his forefinger. Amy giggled over how cute the sneezes had sounded. She'd always thought Sonic's sneezes were cute, but now that he was sneezing in an even cuter way, she felt like she was in heaven.
Bless you.
Thank you, Sonic replied as he continued to rub his nose. He reached over to his box of tissues, pulled one out, and tried blowing his nose again, but it was no use. He couldn't get his nose to clear up. He sighed to himself in slight dismay as he wiped his nose with that same tissue, but Amy placed her hand on his shoulder to comfort him.
It'll be okay, Sonic. I promise, she reassured him. I know being sick isn't all it's cracked up to be, but we're going to help you get through it.
Sonic sniffled, but he smiled at Amy. Even if she did annoy him most of the time, he appreciated that she genuinely cared about him. A few minutes later, Tails and Knuckles came back into the living room. Sonic could see that Tails was holding a mug of steaming tea in his hands. With a couple of quiet sniffles, Sonic lowered his tissue from their view. Here, Sonic. Me and Knuckles made some tea for you. Tails offered the mug to Sonic. Thanks, Tails. Sonic gave a grateful smile as he took the mug in both of his hands. He then took a good sip of the tea, letting the hot liquid run down his throat. Well, what do you think? Knuckles asked. It's pretty good, Sonic said with a sniffle. But I don't know if it'll help you feel better. Believe me, Sonic, it will, said Tails. I've actually had this kind of tea before. Even if it doesn't cure you, it is a good remedy for nasal congestion. If there's one thing that can relieve a cold and taste great at the same time, it's tea, Amy agreed. Sonic nodded in agreement, but then gave another light sneeze, the sound of which caused Amy to smile. He then rubbed his nose with his forefinger before taking another sip of his tea. He does have a pretty cute sneeze, though, Knuckles said to Amy, keeping his voice down so Sonic wouldn't hear him.
I know, right? Wouldn't it be awesome if he always sneezed like this?
Amy agreed, giggling. Sonic gave her a funny look in response to her comment, but continued drinking his tea until his mug had been emptied. By the time he'd finished, his nose was feeling quite a bit less congested, although it was still a noticeable shade of red. Feeling better, dude? Knuckles asked. A little, Sonic claimed.
His nose then twitched again, however, and he brought up his arm to cover his mouth before letting out another sneeze. Achoo! He then rubbed his nose again with his forefinger, giving a cute, sheepish smile as he did.
"Aw, bless you," Amy said, her eyes sparkling.
Tails chuckled a bit, not only from the sound of the sneeze, but from the look on Sonic's face as well.
"Bless you, Sonic."
"Yeah, bless you," Knuckles replied. "Thanks." Sonic sniffled a couple of times as he continued to rub his nose. At least he didn't need to blow his nose this time around. He lay down on the couch, trying to get comfortable. As he did, Amy stood up from the couch and tucked Sonic in, switching off his electric blanket before gently pushing the corners of his other blankets underneath them. "Try and get some rest, Sonic. We'll be here if you need us."
"Thanks, guys." Sonic yawned quietly into his hand, and then turned over, letting his eyelids fall closed. As he drifted off into a peaceful sleep, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy walked away from him, smiling at one another. Even if none of them knew exactly how many days his case of tiny sneeze would go on for, they were more than willing to take care of their friend for the time being. Hopefully it wouldn't be too long before he started feeling better. The end.